Picture yourself putting on the uniform of history's most terrifying organization, the black jacket bearing the silver skull, those lightning bolt insignias on your collar. Each morning, you pass by your basement door, fully aware that below your feet, concealed in complete darkness, a Jewish family breathes, and their discovery would mean death for you and for them. This isn't a work of fiction. This isn't something dreamed up by Hollywood writers. This actually took place. The person who did this wasn't operating as a spy, wasn't working as a double agent, wasn't someone plotting secretly to turn against the Reich. His name was Albert Göring, a decorated SS officer. For 3 full years, he transformed his residence into the most perilous hiding spot in all of Nazi Germany, where a single noise, one inquisitive neighbor, one surprise inspection could instantly end 6 human lives. The question haunting you once this video concludes won't be about the mechanics of how he pulled it off, but rather why a man who had pledged himself to Jewish extermination would choose to gamble everything, his reputation, his family's honor, his very life, to rescue them. Before we explore this impossibility, we must first understand Albert Göring's world, because without that framework, you'll never truly comprehend the madness of his actions. The year is 1941, and Germany stands at the peak of its might. The Wehrmacht has seized control of most of the European continent. The SS, the Schutzstaffel, has evolved beyond being merely Hitler's personal protection force. It has transformed into the mechanism carrying out the final solution, the guardian of racial purity, the executioner of millions upon millions. Being part of the SS means more than being a soldier. It means becoming an ideological warrior, a true believer in Aryan supremacy and the elimination of everyone who poses a threat to it. Each SS officer swears an oath of complete loyalty to Adolf Hitler. This oath isn't merely symbolic, it's written in blood. It's forged in iron. It's maintained through terror. In this reality, grey areas don't exist. You're either supporting the Reich or you're counted among its enemies. There's no intermediate position, no space for uncertainty, and absolutely no tolerance for showing mercy toward the Jewish people, who by 1941 are being systematically gathered up, stripped of all rights, forced into ghettos, and transported to camps whose real function is only whispered about in the Reich's darkest corners. Albert Göring entered this world, but he didn't embrace this ideology. His upbringing was in Munich as the son of a prominent German official, and his early years were marked by privilege, cultural exposure, and a certain remove from the fanaticism that would eventually devour his nation. He enlisted in the SS, not driven by ideological passion, but from duty, a belief that every capable German male owed service to the fatherland. His performance was solid, competent, dependable, the sort of officer who executed orders without raising questions. Yet something within Albert never completely synchronized with the hate machinery surrounding him. Perhaps it stemmed from his mother's influence, her quiet emphasis on human decency. Perhaps it came from the Jewish families he'd known in the pre-war years. The shop owners, the musicians, the physicians who had once lived nearby. Or perhaps it was simply that Albert Göring possessed something rare and dangerous in Nazi Germany, a conscience that wouldn't stay silent. By 1942, deportations in his district had become standard procedure. Families were pulled from their homes during the night hours, forced onto trucks, and vanished, Albert observed. He remained silent, until one particular day when he witnessed something that shattered him. A family, the Rosenfelds, residing just 3 blocks from his residence, were being taken away. The father worked as a tailor, the mother played piano. 2 children accompanied them, an 8-year-old boy and a 12-year-old girl. Albert had known them before the laws changed, before the yellow stars appeared, before the fear took hold. As he watched them being forced into the truck's rear, their hands tied, their eyes filled with terror, something fractured inside him. He didn't yet know what action he would take. He only understood that doing nothing was impossible. That evening, Albert made a decision defining the remainder of his existence. He wouldn't openly fight the system. He wouldn't sabotage his unit or escape to the Allies. That would be suicide and would save nobody. Instead, he would do something far more perilous. He would exploit his position, his uniform, his authority as an SS officer to conceal the Rosenfelds in the single location nobody would ever imagine looking, his own basement. He understood the dangers. He knew discovery would result in a trial, a public execution, and his family name's disgrace. But he also recognized that if he walked away, if he allowed that truck to take them to their destination, he could never forgive himself. So, under Nightfall's protection, Albert Göring became a criminal by the Reich's standards. The scheme was absolutely insane. Albert's residence wasn't some remote farmhouse in the countryside. It was a modest row house in a residential area, surrounded by other German families, some who were devoted party members. His neighbors were familiar with him. They knew his routine. They knew about his SS affiliation. And now, concealed beneath where they walked, were 4 Jewish lives, each breath dependent on total silence. The basement was cramped, moist, and without light. No windows existed, no air circulation, no toilet facilities. Albert had to sneak food down to them nightly and dispose of waste in buckets he buried in his modest backyard. The Rosenfelds couldn't speak louder than whispers. They couldn't move during daytime, when neighbors might detect footsteps. They couldn't cough, weep, or produce any sound that might alert the world above to their presence. For 3 years, they existed like phantoms in the darkness. And for 3 years, Albert Göring walked the streets wearing his black uniform, knowing each knock on his door could signal the end. The initial week proved hardest, not due to logistics, but due to fear. Albert had prepared the basement as thoroughly as possible, bringing down blankets, several chairs, some stored provisions, and a single oil lamp the Rosenfelds could illuminate only for brief moments. But nothing could prepare anyone for the psychological burden of what they'd undertaken. The Rosenfeld family had transitioned from a life of relative normalcy, despite increasingly harsh restrictions, to complete erasure from existence. Officially, they had ceased to exist. Their names had been removed from the deportation list, marked as transported, and nobody in the Reich bureaucracy would question it. Albert had utilized his SS credentials to modify the paperwork himself, a forgery that could unravel at any instant if someone chose to audit the records. Above ground, Albert maintained his daily pattern. He rose at 6 each morning, donned his uniform, and reported for duty. He sat through briefings, submitted reports, and saluted his commanding officers. By every appearance, he was a faithful SS officer, and that performance needed to be perfect because even a trace of doubt, even one suspicion, would bring the Gestapo to his doorstep. The neighbors represented the most immediate danger. In Nazi Germany, the informing culture had become nearly pathological. Block wardens maintained lists of every household, recording who arrived and departed, who displayed the flag on party holidays, who attended rallies. Children learned in school to report their own parents if they overheard defeatist talk or criticism of the Führer. Albert's neighbor on the left, Herr Kroer, was a retired postal worker and an enthusiastic party member who had once reported a grocer for hoarding butter. The neighbor on the right, Frau Wey, was a widow whose son had perished on the Eastern Front, and her sorrow had transformed into bitter nationalism, making her suspicious of everyone. Albert knew both of them monitored his house, not necessarily from malice, but from perceived duty. Every time he brought groceries inside, every time he worked late into the evening in his small backyard, he could sense their observation. He had to give them nothing. No deviation from pattern, no unexplained behavior, no cause for curiosity. The first narrow escape arrived in the 3rd week. It was a Sunday morning, and Albert was upstairs preparing a modest breakfast when he heard the knock. It was Herr Kroer requesting to borrow a hammer. Albert's heart ceased, not because the request was strange, but because he'd left the basement door slightly open. If Kroer stepped inside, if he glanced down the hallway, he might notice it. Albert manufactured a smile, told Kroer to wait, and walked calmly to the door, shutting it as he retrieved the hammer from an outdoor shed. The entire exchange lasted under 3 minutes, but after Kroer finally departed, Albert's hands trembled so violently he could barely grasp a water cup. Below, the Rosenfelds had detected the voices and frozen in complete silence, the children holding their breath, the parents clutching each other in the darkness. That evening, Albert installed a lock on the basement door and practiced a cover story. If anyone ever inquired, he would claim he stored sensitive SS documents below, files requiring security. It was weak, but it was something. As weeks transformed into months, a grim pattern emerged. Albert would depart for work before sunrise, and the Rosenfelds would stay motionless in the basement until his return after nightfall. He would deliver food, empty the waste containers, and share news of the outside world, though the news was seldom encouraging. The war was growing, the deportations were intensifying. The camps were no longer rumor, but confirmed reality, and the accounts filtering back exceeded comprehension. Albert didn't share everything with the Rosenfelds because he understood that hope, regardless how fragile, was the sole thing sustaining them. But he also recognized that with each passing day the war continued, the probability of discovery increased. SS inspections were multiplying. The Gestapo was intensifying their crackdown on black market operations, which meant more raids, more searches, more justifications to enter homes without warning. Albert was walking a tightrope, and the wind was beginning to strengthen. By the close of 1942, Albert Göring had split into two people. During daylight, he was the obedient soldier, the man in the black uniform who clicked his heels and raised his arm in salute. During nighttime, he was the criminal, the traitor, the man who descended into his basement and whispered reassurances to a family the Reich had sentenced to death. He didn't view himself as heroic. He saw himself as a man attempting not to drown in his own complicity. And each morning, when he faced himself in the mirror before donning that uniform, he posed the identical question: how much longer can this possibly last? The psychological damage to the Rosenfeld family was tremendous, and Albert witnessed it develop with a helplessness that gnawed at him. The father, Jacob Rosenfeld, had been a tailor with some reputation, a man who took pride in precision and craftsmanship. Now, his hands had no purpose. He sat in darkness for hours, running his fingers along the seams of his own clothing. A nervous pattern Albert noticed was wearing the fabric threadbare. The mother, Miriam, had been a pianist, and her silence was perhaps the most cruel punishment. She would sometimes move her fingers through the air as though playing invisible keys, her lips forming soundless words to music only she could hear. The children suffered in different ways. The boy, David, who had been 8 upon entering hiding, was now developing in the darkness, his body extending, but his world contracting. The girl, Rachel, 12, when they descended, was entering adolescence in a tomb. No birthdays existed, no celebrations, no sunlight. Albert attempted to bring them small comforts, a book occasionally, a piece of chocolate sometimes, but he understood these were mere drops in an ocean of deprivation. The worst aspect was the silence. They couldn't laugh. They couldn't cry with volume. They couldn't be human in the manner humans require. Albert's own existence above ground was becoming increasingly challenging to sustain. His superiors at the SS had recognized his efficiency, and with that recognition arrived more responsibility. He received promotion to a position demanding more meetings, more reports, and more time away from home. This proved dangerous for 2 reasons. First, it meant reduced time caring for the Rosenfelds, less time bringing food and news, less time monitoring the house for threats. Second, it meant increased scrutiny. Higher rank meant greater visibility, and greater visibility meant more colleagues visiting his residence, more invitations to social events, more expectations that he would engage in the SS social rituals. He had to refuse most invitations without appearing antisocial or raising suspicion. He claimed he was tending to an ill relative, an aunt in the countryside, requiring regular visits. It was a fabrication constructed on a foundation of other fabrications, and Albert understood that lies, like houses, eventually crumble under their own weight. The winter of 1942 into 1943 was harsh. Coal was rationed, and Albert couldn't risk using excessive amounts to heat his home without attracting attention. Upstairs, he maintained the house cold enough to appear normal for wartime. Downstairs, the Rosenfelds shivered beneath thin blankets, their breath visible in the frigid air. Miriam developed a cough she attempted desperately to suppress, pressing a cloth to her mouth whenever the spasms arrived. Albert brought her medicine when possible, but medicine was limited, and requesting too much would raise questions. The children grew more gaunt. David's growth spurt meant constant hunger, but food was never sufficient. Rachel stopped menstruating, her body shutting down non-essential processes to preserve energy. Albert observed all this, and the guilt was crushing. He had rescued them from the camps, yes, but he was watching them perish slowly in his basement, and he couldn't determine which fate was worse. The second close call arrived in February of 1943, and it nearly destroyed everything. The Gestapo executed a neighborhood sweep, searching for black market goods and draft evaders. They proceeded door to door, and when they reached Albert's house, he was absent. He was at work, 20 minutes distant, when a neighbor's son rushed to his office reporting that men in leather coats were at his door. Albert's blood froze. He departed immediately, driving at a speed drawing honks and curses from other motorists, his mind racing through possibilities. If they searched the basement, everything ended. If they detected even a whisper from below, everything ended. Upon arrival, the Gestapo men remained there, standing in his living room, examining his papers. Albert forced himself to maintain composure. He greeted them with the proper salute, explained he was an SS officer, and presented his credentials. One Gestapo agent, a thin man wearing wire-rimmed glasses, inquired about the locked basement door. Albert delivered his practice lie: sensitive documents, SS records, security protocol. The agent stared at him for what seemed like eternity, then nodded and continued on. They departed 20 minutes later, discovering nothing. Below, the Rosenfelds hadn't moved a muscle for over an hour. That evening, Albert sat on his kitchen floor and wept, not from relief, but from recognizing this couldn't continue indefinitely. The war wasn't concluding. The Reich wasn't collapsing. If anything, the death machinery was accelerating. And eventually his fortune would exhaust itself. But when he descended that evening and witnessed the Rosenfeld faces, pale and frightened yet alive, he understood he couldn't stop, not yet. Not while breath remained in his body and a lock secured that door. By spring of 1943, the war had reached a turning point, though few in Germany would acknowledge it. The Wehrmacht had suffered catastrophic losses at Stalingrad, and the Reich's invincibility was starting to fracture. But this shift brought no relief to Albert Göring. If anything, it made his circumstances more precarious. As the war turned against Germany, paranoia within the SS intensified. Purges occurred of officers suspected of defeatism. Investigations into loyalty commenced. Surprise inspections happened and mandatory party rallies where attendance was documented and absences recorded. Albert could sense the walls closing in, not because anyone specifically suspected him, but because the entire system was constricting like a noose. He attended every rally, he signed every loyalty pledge, he executed his duties with mechanical precision, but internally he was falling apart. The burden of living two lives, of being simultaneously executioner and savior, was shattering him piece by piece. The Rosenfelds were also transforming. 365 days had elapsed since entering the basement, and the psychological damage was becoming apparent. Jacob had almost entirely stopped speaking. He would sit for hours, staring at nothing, his mind withdrawing into some interior realm where Albert couldn't reach him. Miriam's cough had intensified despite the medicine, and she had grown skeletal, her cheekbones sharp against her pale skin. Rachel, now 13, had developed a pattern of rocking back and forth, a self-soothing motion she seemed unconscious of. David, the youngest, had stopped asking when they could depart. He had accepted, in the manner children do, that this darkness was now his reality. Albert attempted to provide them hope, explaining the Allies were advancing, that the war couldn't continue forever, but his words rang hollow even to himself. Hope demanded a future, and none of them could envision beyond the following day. The third close call arrived in May, and it proved the most dangerous yet. Albert's commanding officer, Hauptsturmführer Veroche, invited himself to Albert's residence for dinner. It wasn't a request, it was an order disguised as social courtesy. Krauch was a true believer, a man who wore his SS uniform even during off days, and who discussed the final solution with pride. He was also suspicious by nature, the type of officer who believed vigilance was the supreme virtue. Albert had no option but to accept. He spent the entire day before the dinner in controlled panic. He relocated everything in the house that might appear unusual. He locked the basement door and positioned a filing cabinet before it, making it resemble storage. He instructed the Rosenfelds that regardless of what they heard, regardless of how long the evening lasted, they must remain absolutely silent. That evening, Krauch arrived at 7, carrying a bottle of schnapps and wearing a smile that didn't extend to his eyes. The dinner was nightmarish. Krauch talked for hours, rambling about the war, about the inferiority of Slavic races, about the necessity of exterminating the Jewish threat. Albert nodded, concurred, performed the role of the loyal officer, but every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the house, arrested his heart. At one moment, Krauch requested to use the bathroom, and Albert directed him upstairs, his hand trembling as he indicated the direction. Krauch was absent for 5 minutes, and during that time, Albert imagined every conceivable disaster. What if Krauch detected something? What if he opened the incorrect door? What if the Rosenfelds coughed or shifted? When Krauch returned, he appeared satisfied, and Albert exhaled for the first time in an hour. The dinner finally concluded at midnight, and Krauch departed with a handshake and a promise to visit again soon. Albert locked the door behind him, leaned against it, and felt his legs collapse. Below, the Rosenfelds had heard every word. They had heard Krauch's voice praising the camps. They had heard him laughing about the deportations, and they had heard Albert agreeing with him, performing his role. When Albert descended that evening, Jacob regarded him with something Albert had never witnessed before. Not gratitude, not trust, but doubt. And Albert understood, to the Rosenfelds, he was their savior. But he was also a man wearing an SS uniform who had just spent 4 hours celebrating their extermination. The boundary between who he pretended to be and who he truly was had become so thin that even Albert no longer knew where one concluded and the other began. The summer of 1943 introduced a new terror, one Albert hadn't anticipated. The Allied bombing campaigns over Germany had intensified, and his city was now a target. Air raid sirens wailed at all hours, sending the population scrambling into public shelters and reinforced basements. For most Germans, the bombings were a source of fear and rage. For Albert, they were a logistical catastrophe. Every time the siren sounded, his neighbors fled to the communal shelter 3 blocks distant. And every time, they expected Albert to accompany them. But Albert couldn't abandon his house. If he went to the shelter, the Rosenfelds would be alone, vulnerable, and if a bomb struck the house, they would perish trapped in the basement with no possibility of escape. And if he remained home during a raid, his absence from the shelter would be noticed, questioned, and reported. He was trapped between 2 impossible choices, and the bombs descended with increasing frequency. Albert developed a system, though it was fragile and desperate. When the sirens sounded during daytime while he was at work, nothing could be done. He would sit in the SS bunker with his colleagues, listening to the explosions overhead, and pray his house wasn't struck. When the sirens sounded at night, he would wait until his neighbors had departed for the shelter, then descend into the basement and remain with the Rosenfelds. He would hold the children as the bombs fell, feeling the house tremble with each impact, the walls groaning, dust falling from the ceiling. Miriam would pray in Hebrew, her voice barely audible above the chaos. Jacob would sit rigid, his hands gripping his chair's edge, and Albert would count the seconds between explosions, calculating distance, wondering if the next one would be the one burying them all. On 2 occasions, bombs landed near enough to shatter the upstairs windows and crack the foundation. On one occasion, a fire erupted 3 houses down, and Albert had to join the bucket brigade to extinguish it, leaving the Rosenfelds alone in the smoke-filled basement, choking and terrified. The bombings also introduced a new danger, one Albert hadn't foreseen. After each raid, officials would inspect the neighborhood for structural damage, checking basements and foundations to ensure buildings were safe. This meant strangers, city engineers, and party officials walking through homes, opening doors, asking questions. Albert couldn't refuse these inspections without arousing suspicion, so he had to discover a way to hide the Rosenfelds even more completely. He constructed a false wall in the basement, a crude partition made from old wood and plaster that created a hidden space barely large enough for 4 people to stand. When inspectors arrived, the Rosenfelds would squeeze into this coffin-sized void, pressing their bodies together in total darkness, not breathing, not moving, while men walked just feet distant on the opposite side. The first time this occurred, Rachel fainted from oxygen deprivation, and Albert had to revive her afterward, her lips blue, her pulse weak. He knew this couldn't continue. The false wall wasn't soundproof. It wasn't airtight. It was a temporary solution to an impossible problem, and every inspection brought them nearer to discovery. By August, the strain was visible on everyone. Albert had lost weight, his uniform hanging loose on his frame. His hands had developed a tremor he couldn't control, and his superiors had started noticing. One officer asked if he was ill, if he needed leave. Albert declined, knowing leave would mean someone else monitoring his house, someone else asking questions. The Rosenfelds were deteriorating faster. Miriam's cough had turned chronic, a wet, rattling sound she could no longer fully suppress. Jacob had stopped eating, pushing his meager portions toward the children. Rachel had begun pulling out her own hair, a nervous compulsion leaving bald patches on her scalp. David, now 9, had stopped growing. His body, deprived of sunlight and nutrition, had simply surrendered. Albert brought them vitamins when possible, but vitamins couldn't replace hope, and hope was the single thing he could no longer provide. The 4th close call arrived in September, and it resulted from something Albert could never have predicted. A water pipe burst in the street outside his house, and city workers had to excavate the road to repair it. The work required accessing the underground pipes, which meant inspecting every basement on the block to ensure no water damage existed. Albert received 2 hours' notice. 2 hours to prepare for strangers to walk through his basement, to examine his walls, to inspect his foundation. 2 hours to decide whether to hide the Rosenfelds in the false wall and risk them suffocating, or to relocate them somewhere else. But where? Nowhere else existed. Albert made the only choice possible. He hid them in the false wall, provided them a damp cloth to breathe through, and told them that regardless of what happened, they couldn't produce a sound. The inspection lasted 40 minutes, 40 minutes of hell. And when it concluded, when the workers finally departed, Albert tore down the false wall with his bare hands and extracted the Rosenfelds. They were unconscious, all 4 of them, their skin gray, their breathing shallow. He revived them one by one, and when they finally opened their eyes, he witnessed something in their faces that terrified him more than the Gestapo, more than the bombs. He saw resignation. They were beginning to surrender. The autumn of 1943 arrived with a cold that seemed to penetrate the city's bones, and with it came a shift in the war that even the most devoted party members could no longer disregard. The Allies had invaded Italy, and Mussolini had fallen. The Red Army was pushing westward, reclaiming territory mile by bloody mile. In Berlin, the propaganda machine worked overtime to sustain morale, but the fractures were showing. Food rations were reduced again. Coal was nearly impossible to acquire. The cities were grey with ash and despair. For Albert, these developments meant 2 things. First, the war's conclusion was no longer fantasy, but a distant possibility, though how distant remained uncertain. Second, the SS was becoming more brutal, more desperate, more willing to strike at anyone suspected of disloyalty. Officers were being arrested on the flimsiest of pretexts. Neighbors were informing on neighbors with renewed fervor. The machine was consuming itself, and Albert was standing directly in its jaws. The Rosenfelds had now been in the basement for 2 years, and the physical and mental toll had become catastrophic. Miriam's cough had evolved into something far worse, a lung infection leaving her feverish and delirious. She would awaken at night, calling out names of people long deceased, her voice loud enough to arrest Albert's heart. He brought her antibiotics stolen from the SS medical supplies, but the infection was deep and stubborn. Jacob had retreated so far into himself that he barely acknowledged Albert's presence anymore. He would sit in the corner, rocking back and forth, muttering prayers in a language Albert didn't understand. Rachel, now 14, had stopped speaking entirely. She communicated only through gestures, her eyes empty and distant. David was the only one who still seemed to possess fight, but even that was diminishing. He would ask Albert questions about the outside world, about the sun, about trees, about things he could barely remember. And Albert would answer, painting pictures with words of a world that felt as distant to him as it did to the boy. Albert's own mental state was deteriorating in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had started experiencing what he could only describe as dissociation. Moments where he felt like he was observing himself from outside his own body. He would be sitting in an SS meeting, nodding along to discussions of deportation quotas and labor camp logistics, and suddenly he would feel like he wasn't really there, like he was a ghost haunting his own existence. At night, he would lie in bed and stare at the ceiling, unable to sleep, unable to think, unable to feel anything except a numb exhaustion that no amount of rest could cure. He had stopped shaving regularly. He had stopped caring about his appearance. His uniform was wrinkled, his boots unpolished. Other officers noticed, and one even pulled him aside to ask if he was drinking. Albert denied it. But the truth was worse than alcoholism. He was simply running out of the capacity to pretend. The fifth close call arrived in October, and it was the one that nearly destroyed him. The Gestapo launched a citywide operation targeting black market networks, and as part of the sweep, they conducted random searches of SS officers' homes to ensure nobody was abusing their position for personal gain. Albert received the notice on a Thursday morning. They would arrive on Saturday at 10 in the morning. He had less than 48 hours to prepare. The problem was that no way to prepare existed. The false wall had been dismantled after the water inspection. The basement was too small to hide 4 people without some kind of partition, and even if he rebuilt it, the Rosenfelds were too weak to endure another confinement in that airless space. Albert considered for the first time the possibility of surrender. He thought about simply opening the door when the Gestapo arrived and letting them discover the family. At least then, it would be finished. At least then he could stop pretending. But when he descended that night and saw Miriam's fevered face, Jacob's hollow eyes, Rachel's silent stare, and David's small hand reaching out to touch his, he knew he couldn't surrender. Not yet. Albert spent Friday night rebuilding the false wall, working by lamplight, his hands bleeding from splinters, his body shaking with exhaustion. He made it thicker this time, double-layered, with a small air vent disguised as a crack in the foundation. When he finished at dawn, he brought the Rosenfelds to the hidden space and explained what would occur. They would have to remain inside for as long as the search lasted. They would have to control their breathing. They would have to trust him one more time. Miriam, barely conscious, nodded. Jacob said nothing. Rachel closed her eyes. David squeezed Albert's hand and whispered the first words Albert had heard from him in weeks. He said, "Thank you." And then Albert sealed them inside, climbed the stairs, donned his uniform, and waited for the knock on the door. The knock arrived at exactly 10 in the morning, sharp and authoritative, the kind of knock that announced power without requiring words. Albert opened the door to discover 3 Gestapo agents standing on his doorstep, 2 men and 1 woman, all dressed in the long leather coats that had become synonymous with terror. The lead agent, a man named Standartenführer Ernst Hoffmann, was someone Albert recognized from SS gatherings, a cold-eyed bureaucrat known for his thoroughness. Hoffmann didn't smile. He simply presented the search warrant, a single typed page bearing the official Reich seal, and walked past Albert into the house without waiting for invitation. The other 2 agents followed, their boots heavy on the wooden floor. Albert's heart was pounding so intensely he was certain they could hear it, but he kept his face neutral, his posture correct, his voice steady as he inquired if there was a specific reason for the search. Hoffmann replied, "There was no specific reason. This was routine, and this was policy." And then he instructed Albert to remain in the living room while they conducted their inspection. The next hour was the longest of Albert's existence. He sat on the couch, his hands folded in his lap, listening to the sounds of the agents moving through his house. He heard drawers opening, closets being searched, floorboards being tested for hollow spaces. He heard them upstairs, moving through his bedroom, his bathroom, his small study, and then he heard the sound he had been dreading, footsteps descending the stairs to the basement. His entire body went rigid. He wanted to stand, to follow them, to control the situation, but he knew that would only make him appear suspicious. So he sat, and he waited, and he prayed to a God he was no longer certain he believed in. Below, behind the false wall, the Rosenfelds were holding their breath. Miriam's fever had spiked that morning, and she was trembling uncontrollably, her body fighting an infection that was slowly killing her. Jacob had his arms around her, holding her still, his own body a cage to keep her silent. Rachel and David were pressed against the wall, their eyes closed, their hands clasped together. They could hear the voices of the agents, muffled but close, discussing the layout of the basement, the age of the foundation, the dampness of the walls. One of the agents, the woman, noticed the false wall immediately. She called Hoffmann over, pointing to the seam where the new wood met the old plaster. Albert, still sitting upstairs, heard her voice and felt his blood turn to ice. He heard Hoffmann ask a question, something about renovations, and then he heard footsteps ascending the stairs. Hoffmann appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable, and asked Albert when he had performed work on the basement. Albert's mind raced. He couldn't say he had done no work because the evidence was right there. He couldn't say it was recent because that would invite more questions. So he lied. He said he had reinforced the wall 2 years prior after a minor flood to prevent water damage. He said it was shoddy work done quickly, and he had been intending to hire a professional but hadn't had the time. Hoffmann stared at him for what felt like an eternity, then nodded and returned to the basement. Albert heard him instruct the other agents to check the wall for structural integrity. He heard them tapping on it, testing its strength, and then he heard the sound that nearly stopped his heart. A cough, faint, muffled, but unmistakable. The basement went silent. Albert could hear nothing, not even the sound of breathing, and that silence was worse than any noise. He stood up, his body moving on instinct, and walked to the top of the basement stairs. Hoffmann was standing at the bottom, his head tilted, listening. The other 2 agents had stopped moving. The woman had her hand on her sidearm. Albert forced himself to speak, his voice calm, almost bored. He said the pipes in the basement sometimes made strange noises, especially in cold weather, a rattling sound that echoed through the walls. He said it had been occurring for months, and he had reported it to the city, but nobody had come to repair it. Hoffmann looked at him, then looked back at the wall. He tapped it once more, hard, and the sound reverberated through the space. Behind the wall, the Rosenfelds didn't move. They didn't breathe. They didn't exist. And after a moment that stretched into eternity, Hoffmann turned away. He told the other agents they were finished. He walked up the stairs, past Albert, and out the front door without another word. Albert stood at the top of the stairs for 5 minutes after they departed, unable to move, unable to think. His legs felt like water. His vision was blurred. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, a deafening drum that drowned out everything else. Finally, he descended the stairs, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the railing. He dismantled the false wall piece by piece, and when he finally pulled the last board away, he saw the Rosenfelds collapsed in a heap, their bodies entangled, their faces pale. Miriam was unconscious, her breathing shallow and ragged. Jacob was weeping silently, his shoulders shaking. Rachel and David were holding each other, their eyes wide and unfocused. Albert pulled them out one by one, laying them on the basement floor. And then he sat down beside them and put his head in his hands. He didn't cry, he didn't speak. He simply sat there in the cold and the darkness and realized they couldn't survive another search. The luck had run out. The next time, they would all perish. The winter of 1943 into 1944 was the darkest period of the entire ordeal. Not because of any single catastrophic event, but because of the slow, grinding realization that survival was no longer a matter of luck or skill, but of sheer endurance against impossible odds. Miriam's condition had worsened to the point where she could no longer stand. Her lung infection had spread, and without proper medical care, Albert knew she was dying. He stole morphine from the SS medical supplies, enough to ease her pain, but not enough to cure her. She spent her days in a fevered half-sleep, mumbling in Yiddish, calling out for her mother, for her childhood home, for a world that no longer existed. Jacob sat beside her, holding her hand, his face a mask of grief. He had stopped eating entirely, and Albert could see his body wasting away, his skin hanging loose over his bones. Rachel and David had withdrawn into themselves, two ghosts haunting the basement, their eyes empty, their movements slow and mechanical. Albert brought them food, but they barely touched it. He brought them books, but they didn't read. He brought them news of the war, of the Allied advances, of the possibility of liberation, but they no longer believed him. Albert himself was unraveling in ways he could no longer hide. His superiors had noticed his deterioration and had begun asking questions. His performance reviews were declining. His attendance at party functions was inconsistent. His appearance was disheveled. One officer, a man named Obersturmführer Klaus Becker, pulled him aside after a briefing and asked him directly if he was having a nervous breakdown. Albert denied it, but Becker wasn't convinced. He suggested Albert take medical leave, that he see a doctor, that he consider a transfer to a less demanding post. Albert refused, knowing any of those options would mean losing control of his house, losing access to the basement, losing the ability to protect the Rosenfelds. But his refusal only deepened the suspicion. Becker began monitoring him more closely, asking more questions, appearing at his home unannounced under the pretense of friendly visits. Albert could sense the net tightening, and he knew it was only a matter of time before someone discovered the truth. The sixth close call arrived in January of 1944, and it was the result of something Albert had no control over. A neighbor's child, a boy of 10 named Hans, had been playing in the street when he claimed to have heard voices coming from Albert's basement. The boy told his mother, who told Herr Kroer, who reported it to the block warden. The block warden, a vicious man named Friedrich Langanger, came to Albert's door the next day and demanded to inspect the basement. Albert's mind went blank. He couldn't refuse without confirming the suspicion. He couldn't allow the inspection without revealing the Rosenfelds. He was trapped. And then, in a moment of desperate improvisation, Albert did something he had never done before. He used his rank. He told Langanger the basement contained classified SS materials related to an ongoing investigation, and that unauthorized access was a violation of Reich security protocol. He said it with such authority, such cold bureaucratic menace, that Langanger hesitated. Albert pressed the advantage. He asked Langanger if he wanted to be responsible for compromising an SS operation. He asked if Langanger understood the consequences of interfering with classified work. And Langanger, a man whose entire identity was built on obedience to authority, backed down. He apologized. He left. But Albert knew the reprieve was temporary. Langanger would report the incident to his superiors, and eventually someone with more authority than Albert would come asking questions. That night, Albert made a decision he had been avoiding for months. He had to find a way to get the Rosenfelds out of the basement, out of his house, out of Germany entirely. But how? The borders were sealed. The trains were monitored. The entire country was a prison. And yet Albert knew staying was no longer an option. The searches were becoming more frequent. The suspicions were growing. Miriam was dying, and the rest of the family wasn't far behind. If they remained in the basement, they would all die, either from disease, discovery, or despair. Albert began making inquiries, careful, indirect questions to people he thought might have connections to resistance networks or smuggling operations. He used his SS credentials to access files on border patrols, looking for weaknesses, gaps in coverage, times when security was relaxed. He was playing a dangerous game, and he knew one wrong move would expose not only the Rosenfelds, but himself. But he also knew doing nothing was a death sentence. And so for the first time in 3 years, Albert Göring began planning not just for survival, but for escape. The plan began taking shape in February. Albert had made contact through a series of intermediaries with a man who claimed to have connections to a smuggling route through Switzerland. The man, whose name Albert never learned, said he could move people across the border for a price. The price was astronomical, more money than Albert possessed. But he began selling everything he owned, his father's watch, his mother's jewelry, books, furniture, anything of value. He withdrew his savings, cashed in bonds, and even stole from SS funds, covering his tracks with falsified reports. By March, he had enough. The smuggler agreed to take the Rosenfelds. But there was a catch. They had to be able to walk. They had to be strong enough to travel 50 kilometers on foot through the mountains. And as Albert looked at the 4 skeletal figures in his basement, Miriam barely conscious, Jacob emaciated, Rachel and David hollow-eyed and weak, he realized they weren't ready. They might never be ready. But they had no choice. The plan was set for April, and Albert prayed they would all live long enough to see it through. April of 1944 arrived with a false spring. Warm days that melted the last of the snow and gave the illusion the world might be healing. But for Albert and the Rosenfelds, time was running out, in ways having nothing to do with the weather. Miriam had deteriorated to the point where she could no longer speak coherently. Her body was failing, and Albert knew moving her in her condition was tantamount to killing her. But leaving her behind wasn't an option. The smuggler had been clear. All 4 or none, no exceptions. Albert spent every night for 2 weeks attempting to build up their strength, bringing them extra food he had stockpiled, vitamins he had hoarded, anything that might give them a chance. He made them walk short distances initially, back and forth across the basement, building their endurance. Jacob could barely stand. Rachel moved like a sleepwalker. David tried his best, but his legs trembled after just a few steps, and Miriam simply lay on the floor, her breathing shallow, her eyes unfocused. Albert realized with a cold certainty they weren't going to make it, but the date was set. The smuggler would be waiting on April 15th at midnight, at a farm 20 kilometers outside the city, and if they didn't show, there would be no second chance. The days leading up to the escape were a blur of preparation and terror. Albert had to request leave from his duties, claiming a family emergency, a story met with skepticism but ultimately approved. He gathered supplies, warm clothes, water, food, medicine, everything they would need for the journey. He studied maps, memorizing routes, backup plans, places to hide if they were spotted. He rehearsed the story they would tell if stopped, a lie about relocating workers to a labor camp. Paperwork he had forged using stolen SS documents. Every detail had to be perfect, because there would be no room for error. On the night of April 14th, Albert brought the Rosenfelds upstairs for the first time in 2 years and 7 months. They stood in his living room, blinking in the dim lamplight, their bodies swaying, disoriented by the space, by the ceiling above their heads, by the simple act of standing on a floor that wasn't damp concrete. Miriam collapsed immediately, and Albert had to carry her to the couch. Jacob wept. Rachel stared at the walls as though they were hallucinations. David reached out and touched the window, his fingers trembling against the glass, and whispered he had forgotten what glass felt like. They departed at 11 that night, moving through the empty streets like shadows. Albert had timed their departure to coincide with the changing of the night patrols, a 15-minute window when the streets were least monitored. He carried Miriam in his arms, her body so light it terrified him. Jacob leaned on Rachel, who leaned on David, the three of them forming a chain of mutual support. They moved slowly, painfully, every step an agony. Twice they had to stop and hide when they heard voices, pressing themselves into doorways, holding their breath. Once a patrol car passed within 10 meters, its headlights sweeping across the street, and Albert was certain they had been seen. But the car kept moving, and they kept walking. It took them 2 hours to reach the edge of the city, a journey that should have taken 30 minutes. By the time they reached the rendezvous point, a dilapidated barn on the outskirts of a farm, Miriam was unconscious, and Jacob had collapsed twice. The smuggler was waiting, a wiry man in his 50s with a face betraying no emotion. He looked at the Rosenfelds, then at Albert, and shook his head. He said they would never make it. They were too weak, too sick. The journey through the mountains required stamina, speed, and silence, and these people had none of those things. Albert pulled the smuggler aside, his voice urgent, desperate. He offered more money, double the agreed price, everything he had left. The smuggler considered, then agreed, but with a condition. If any of them slowed the group down, if any of them made noise attracting patrols, he would leave them behind. No exceptions, no sentiment. Survival wasn't charity. Albert agreed because he had no other choice. The group set out at 1 in the morning, moving through the forest on paths that barely existed. Trails used by deer and smugglers, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. The journey was brutal. The terrain was steep, the ground uneven, the darkness absolute. Miriam had to be carried on a makeshift stretcher, a blanket tied between 2 branches, with Albert and the smuggler taking turns bearing the weight. Jacob stumbled constantly, his body giving out every few hundred meters. Rachel and David held hands, moving in silence, their faces blank with exhaustion. They walked for 6 hours without stopping, and by dawn they had covered less than half the distance. The smuggler said they were moving too slowly. He said at this pace they would be caught before reaching the border. And then he looked at Miriam, still unconscious on the stretcher, and said what Albert had been dreading. He said she wasn't going to survive the journey. He said they should leave her. And Albert, for the first time in 3 years, said no. What happened next would define the rest of Albert's life. He told the smuggler to take Jacob, Rachel, and David ahead. He said he would stay with Miriam, that he would find another way, that he wouldn't abandon her after bringing her this far. The smuggler shrugged, indifferent, and turned to leave. Jacob refused to go. He said he would stay with his wife. Rachel and David clung to their parents, sobbing, begging not to be separated. And for a moment, the entire plan collapsed into chaos. 4 people who had survived 3 years in darkness, now fracturing under the weight of an impossible choice. It was Miriam who ended it. She opened her eyes, her voice a whisper, and told Jacob to go. She told him to take the children. She told him she was dying, that she had been dying for months, and that her death shouldn't be theirs. Jacob refused, but Miriam insisted, her hand gripping his with a strength that seemed impossible. She told him she loved him. She told him he had to live. And then she closed her eyes and let go. Jacob, Rachel, and David departed with the smuggler, disappearing into the forest, their sobs echoing through the trees. Albert stayed with Miriam, holding her hand, watching the sun rise over the mountains. She died an hour later, peacefully, her suffering finally over, and Albert buried her there in a shallow grave beneath a pine tree, marking the spot with a cairn of stones. Then he turned back toward Germany, toward the city, toward the uniform he had abandoned, and walked into the unknown. Albert Göring never returned to his home. He walked for 3 days through the countryside, avoiding main roads, sleeping in barns, drinking from streams, his SS uniform abandoned in a ditch. He knew returning to his post would mean immediate arrest. His absence had been noted, his house had been searched, and by now the Gestapo would have discovered the evidence he had left behind. The false wall, the makeshift living space, the unmistakable signs someone had been hidden there for years. Albert was a wanted man, a traitor to the Reich, and his life as an SS officer was finished. He eventually made contact with a resistance cell operating in the region, and through them he learned Jacob, Rachel, and David had made it across the Swiss border. They were alive, they were safe. And that knowledge, that single piece of information, was the only thing preventing Albert from surrendering to despair. He spent the final year of the war moving from safe house to safe house, helping the resistance in small ways, forging documents, smuggling information, doing whatever he could to atone for the 3 years he had spent wearing the SS uniform. When the war ended in May of 1945, Albert was arrested by Allied forces, not as a war criminal, but as a former SS officer whose record needed examination. The interrogation lasted for months. Albert told them everything. He told them about the Rosenfelds. He told them about the basement. He told them about the searches, the bombings, the near discoveries, the desperate escape. The Allied officers didn't believe him initially. The story was too extraordinary, too convenient, too perfectly designed to absolve an SS officer of guilt. But then they found Jacob Rosenfeld. He was living in a displaced persons camp in Switzerland, along with Rachel and David, waiting for permission to immigrate to America. Jacob testified on Albert's behalf. He described the basement, the 3 years of darkness, the terror, the near misses, the night Albert had carried Miriam through the forest. He showed them the scars, the psychological damage, the evidence his story was true. Rachel and David confirmed everything. The Allied tribunal reviewed the case and concluded Albert Göring had committed no war crimes. In fact, they determined he had risked his life to save a Jewish family at a time when doing so was punishable by death. He was released without charges, a free man in a world that no longer had a place for him. Albert spent the rest of his life in obscurity. He never spoke publicly about what he had done. He never sought recognition or reward. He moved to a small town in Austria, changed his name, and worked as a carpenter, a quiet man who kept to himself and never mentioned the war. Jacob, Rachel, and David immigrated to the United States in 1947, settling in New York, where Jacob reopened his tailor shop and tried rebuilding the life that had been stolen from him. They stayed in contact with Albert through letters, brief notes sent across the ocean, expressions of gratitude that could never fully capture the debt they owed. Rachel became a teacher. David became a doctor. They married, had children, built lives Miriam had died to make possible. And every year, on the anniversary of their escape, they would light a candle for Miriam and for Albert, the man in the SS uniform who had chosen humanity over ideology, decency over duty, and had paid for that choice with everything he had. Albert Göring died in 1973, alone in a small apartment in Vienna. He was 68 years old. His death was noted in a single paragraph in a local newspaper, a brief mention of a retired carpenter with no surviving family. There was no mention of the war, no mention of the SS, no mention of the Rosenfelds. His story remained buried, known only to a handful of people, until decades later, when historians began piecing together the fragmented records of the Holocaust and discovered his name in Jacob's testimony. Today, Albert Göring is remembered, if he is remembered at all, as a footnote in history, a strange anomaly, an SS officer who saved Jews. But his story is more than that. It's a reminder that even in the darkest moments of human history, even in the heart of the most evil system ever created, there were individuals who chose to resist, not with grand gestures or heroic speeches, but with quiet acts of defiance that cost them everything. Albert Göring hid a family in his basement for 3 years, not because he was a saint, but because he was a human being who refused to look away. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson his story can teach us. So why was this story forgotten? Why is Albert Göring not a household name like Oskar Schindler or Raoul Wallenberg? The answer is uncomfortable. Albert wore the uniform of the SS, and that uniform carries a stain no amount of heroism can fully wash away. The world isn't comfortable with moral complexity. We want our heroes to be pure and our villains to be absolute. Albert Göring was neither. He was a man who participated in a monstrous system and then betrayed it. A man who saved lives while wearing the insignia of death. His story doesn't fit neatly into the narratives we tell ourselves about the Holocaust. And so it has been largely ignored, tucked away in archives, mentioned briefly in academic papers, but never celebrated. But his story deserves to be told, not to absolve the SS of its crimes, but to remind us that morality isn't a uniform, it's a choice. And Albert Göring made his choice in the darkness of his basement with a family who would have died without him. That choice matters. That story matters. And now you know it too.